How to best hire a compensation consultant who specializes in executive pay. We're not talking about broad-based compensation here. We're talking about CEO pay, although some of the same principles apply to both. The compensation consultant world for CEO pay is truly a cottage industry. It includes some of the most hardworking and smartest people I know. Their travel schedule is brutal, at least it was before the virus. There aren't too many firms out there that do this kind of work, only several dozen. The firms tend to be fairly small. Many of them have just a smattering of employees. Who to hire and why? Today on Zippy Point. I'm Brock Romanek, and I'm a big fan of yous. Hiring a compensation consultant for CEO pay is an important decision. You really need to do your homework when you're deciding who to hire, particularly when the topic is, how much are we going to pay the big boss? When undertaking this task, you're working with members from the board of directors, specifically the board's compensation committee, who have the ultimate decision-making authority about which consultant to hire. Often someone on the compensation committee, or perhaps the CEO or the board chair, will express a preference about who they want to hire, or at least interview to serve as the committee's compensation consultant. It's common for a referral to be made by a director who currently or formerly worked with a specific consultant in their capacity as a director on another board. This happens because so many directors serve on more than one board at a time. It's an insular fellowship. So before making that hiring decision, there are 8 questions you should be asking. 1, who's doing the hiring? 2, who is helping with the hiring? 3, do they have time to advise you? 4, do they have the expertise you seek? 5, are they willing to ask probing questions? 6, what compensation changes would they recommend? 7, how deep are their resources and services? 8, how much do we pay the consultants? 1, who's doing the hiring? So I'm going to start with this because sometimes the CEO or the head of human resources feels like they get the final say as to which compensation consultant gets hired. That's not true. Your compensation committee's charter states that the committee has this authority in its sole discretion to hire the consultant. Your compensation committee's charter says this because Congress forced the SEC in its 2010 Dodd-Frank reform to force the stock exchanges to revise their listing standards to require that compensation committees be independent when they hire these consultants. Well, both NYC Rule 303A05 and NASDAQ Rule 5605D make clear that the compensation committee charter requires the committee to consider before retaining or receiving advice from an advisor the 6 factors listing in those listing standards. Neither rule makes clear whether the factors also need to be included specifically in the charter. Both the NYC and NASDAQ have indicated that the factors do not need to be set forth in the charter. Instead, the charter may refer generally to the factors, such as by directing the committee to consider all factors required by the exchange's listing standards. So you may need to remind the CEO and the Chief Human Resources Officer that they're overstepping if they go over the line here. Not an easy conversation, but necessary. The law is the law. 2, who is helping with the hiring? It will depend on the desires and personalities within your company, but the head of HR often says they want to take the lead on the hiring process, and that's fine. But that doesn't mean you as a corporate secretary should not be involved. After all, you'll need to work with the consultant. So you should ensure that your views on how to deal with proxy advisors, with institutional investors, on how to educate directors are somewhere near their worldview, that you're simpatico, so that you'll end up having a smooth working relationship. If you're not anywhere near close to being on the same page, your future could include a world of pain. So inject yourself into this process if you can. You also want to glean from your interview with the consultant where they're hoping to try to worm their way into areas beyond their compensation expertise. Some consultants try to broaden their engagement, and that might be an unwelcome intrusion into your governance turf. Better to nip that plan in the bud. There still might be a good hire, but limiting their expectations up front during this initial stage when they're happy just to be hired, easier to do than trying to nip that in the bud when it's not the bud somewhere down the road when they're entrenched with the compensation committee. 3, do they have time to advise you? This clearly is a relationship business. Specifically, who is your consultant matters much more than the firm that they work for. You want to ask if they can truly work within your schedule. Do they have time so they don't wind up being this bait and switch situation where you think you're hiring them specifically, but they're going to be passing you off to their subordinates. So ask how many clients they currently have. Anything more than 12 to 16 clients probably means they're tapped out. Present your known schedule of compensation committees, the ones that are already on the books, and ask if they already have a conflict. If they do, for all the meetings that are on your books, that's truly not a good sign. 4, do they have the expertise you seek? So ask whether they have prior experience with companies in your industry. As for whether this is relevant, this one is a little bit of it depends. For some industries like financial services, it can matter a lot since it's a highly regulated and complicated sector. For others, it doesn't matter so much. Consider whether they have the personality that matches the compensation committee's current demeanor, the committee's culture. They don't have to wind up being best buds, nor do you want the committee to fall into a trap of groupthink, but you want a consultant that won't butt heads on matters that aren't significant. 5, are they willing to ask probing questions? On the other hand, you do want a compensation consultant willing to ask hard questions. You want someone during the interview to be asking you, why did you structure this particular compensation arrangement like you did in the past? Or why are you planning on doing it like that now? After all, you would be paying this advisor for their advice, so get some advice, not a glad hander. 6, what compensation changes would they recommend? I would come right out in the interview and ask, are you willing to ask probing questions? Specifically, ask that. Of course, they will say yes. If not, red flag city. And then follow up by inviting them to ask a few probing questions right now in the interview. Hopefully their questions will illustrate that they've done their homework before the interview. They've read your company's recent SEC filings, the proxy advisor reports about your company, and the investor presentations posted on your IR webpage. So they can also answer the question, what compensation changes would you recommend right now based on our publicly available information? Let them know it's okay to express an opinion without knowing all the facts. They're not going to know all the facts, the things that you haven't publicized. Assure them that you're aware that they might opine on something that wouldn't work for reasons they could not know. So for example, maybe your company has disclosed some things that aren't quite the norm and incentive plan volatility comes to mind. Are they asking you about that? It's a good sign if they do. Are they asking you questions that show they understand your key objectives, how the incentive plans align with those objectives? They should. It's all spelled out in your investor presentations, your earning calls, your proxies. So again, it'll illustrate whether they've done their homework. 7, how deep are their services and resources? So how deep's their bench? You want access to this specific consultant, the one with years and years of experience. But the reality is that they do have a staff that will conduct the analytics and research that underpin the recommendations. So ask how deep that bench is, what their credentials are. Did you get an offer to meet them too? With video conferencing now the norm, this can obviously easily be set up. You should also ask what types of services this firm offers beyond setting executive pay levels, if that matters to you. Some office firms offer a wide range of services that might matter, particularly to companies that are global in nature. That's complicated stuff. This may include services relating to pay for the entire employee base. Hey, how much is this going to cost me? Notice I have not talked about pricing. This cottage industry tends to operate as a fee-based service, hourly rates with perhaps a soft not to exceed cap, which sometimes does get exceeded because a client is asked to run hundreds of scenarios on a possible plan change, way more than expected. A consultant should be able to give you a fee range still for each type of services that you want them to perform. There are many different services that a consultant can get into, reviewing incentive plans, helping to get that plan approved by shareholders, reviewing the CD&A, and many more. Each of these services will have a range of possible activities, a number of compensation committee meetings that comes along with it perhaps. And of course, ad hoc issues always arise for which you may need a consultant's help that you hadn't foreseen. So for example, chief technology officer is fired, so an exit package needs to be worked out. Then a new chief technology officer needs to be hired. Some work with the consultant will inevitably pop up for that. Anticipate a certain level of these emergency scenarios when you're planning your compensation committee budget.